Tonight the fire is burning low, and the insects have started their nighttime work, and the stories are ready. I'm your host. This is Tales After Midnight, where we tell the old stories in the old way, slowly, in the dark, until you're somewhere else entirely. Tonight we're staying on the African continent, 9 stories from West and Central Africa, from the Yoruba of Nigeria, the Akan of Ghana, the Bakweri of Cameroon, the Congo of the Congo Basin. These traditions are among the oldest continuous oral storytelling cultures in the world, and the stories have been told for longer than there have been buildings to tell them in. They're not what you expect, if what you expect is simple monster-in-the-dark stories. The dead in West African traditions aren't separate from the living. The spirits aren't somewhere else. The world is thicker than it appears, and these stories are maps of that thickness. What lives in the rivers, in the forest, in the houses, in the people you know, in the night itself. Make yourself comfortable. Turn down the lights if they're up. You don't need to stay awake for this. Let the fire do its work. The stories will find you, wherever you are. Among the Yoruba, there are children who don't stay. They come into the world the way all children do, small and loud, and wanting everything. They are born, they are named, they are loved, and then they die. An infant's fever, a sickness that moves too fast for any remedy. An accident, an ordinary tragedy in an extraordinary body. But this is where the story turns, because some of those children are born again, to the same mother, into the same family. They come back the way a tide comes back, drawn by something too old to be refused. The Yoruba call them Àbíkú, spirit children. Children who belong, first and always, to the world of the unborn, who are only visiting here, who have companions waiting for them in the spirit realm, who have debts and promises already made that pull them back before they're grown. The word Àbíkú means, more or less, born to die. This is not metaphor. In the Yoruba understanding of the world, the unborn exist as a community, a society of souls waiting in a place called the spirit world, with friendships, with debts, with agreements made before birth. An Àbíkú is a soul who promised to return. The other spirits are waiting for it to come back, and no matter what happens in the living world, no matter how fiercely a mother holds on, the promise pulls harder. Àdùké had buried 4 children, not all in one blow. The first a girl, taken by fever at 3 months, there and gone before Àdùké had learned the particular curl of her fingers. The second a boy, who made it to 2 years before a sickness took him in a week. Long enough for him to learn to walk, long enough for his footprints to mark the dust in the compound. Small prints that Àdùké could not bring herself to sweep away for days afterward. The third was stillborn. There is nothing to say about the third, except that the silence when a child doesn't cry is a silence that fills the room the wrong way, that sits in the corner of every subsequent room you enter. The fourth was a girl again. She lived long enough to laugh, long enough to call Àdùké's name, Ada, Ada, which is not the name Àdùké taught her, but the name the child invented, and which Àdùké would have preferred to any other word in any language. Long enough that when she went, the mother felt something crack inside her that did not fully knit. Her husband grieved alongside her, but differently. He moved through it and came out the other side into something like ordinary life. Aduke couldn't follow him. She stood at the edge of the world her children kept leaving, and she didn't know how to step back from it. When she became pregnant a 5th time, the women of her family watched her with careful eyes. They said prayers and brought herbs and tied certain knots at her waist. Specific knots, in specific patterns, because the Yoruba pharmacopoeia of protection is as precise as any medicine. Her mother-in-law burned something at the doorstep every morning, something that smelled sharp and green and left a thin line of ash that the morning wind did not blow away. No one said the word Àbíkú, but everyone was thinking it. The 5th child was a boy. He was born healthy, strong-lunged, furious with life. He arrived screaming, as if he were angry at the transition, at the indignity of being small and helpless, and at the mercy of gravity. He lived. 2 years, then 3, then 4. Aduke allowed herself, slowly, to unclench. She stopped watching him sleep. She stopped counting his breaths. She stopped standing in the doorway at dawn, listening for the particular quiet that means a child is no longer in the room. She stopped, but not entirely. Not all at once. A mother who has buried 4 children doesn't stop listening. She just learns to listen more quietly. When the 5th child was 6 years old, he came to her one afternoon and said, "Mother, I have to go back soon." She was grinding pepper. The sound of the stone against the stone stopped. The yard went quiet. The chickens were still scratching in the dust. The world was still ordinary, but something had shifted in it. The way a room shifts when you notice a door you hadn't seen before. "Go back where?" she asked. He couldn't explain it in words that made sense. He talked about friends, not the children in the compound, other friends, somewhere else, somewhere he could describe only in feelings, not in geography. He talked about a place that was cool and quiet. He talked about promises. He wasn't frightened. That was the worst part. He spoke about leaving, the way another child might speak about walking to the river, as if the destination were obvious, and the only question was timing. Aduke set down the grinding stone. She went to a babalawo, a diviner, a reader of Ifa, a person who knows what lives on the other side of things. Ifa is the Yoruba divination system, not fortune-telling in the way the word conjures in English, but a vast library of knowledge, encoded in 256 chapters of verses, each chapter containing hundreds of stories, consulted through the throwing of palm nuts, whose patterns indicate which chapter applies to the question being asked. It is one of the oldest knowledge systems on Earth that is still in continuous use. She told the babalawo everything, the 4 dead children, the 5th child's words, the feeling in her chest that something was about to be taken again. The babalawo consulted Ifa. He threw the palm nuts, read the patterns, was silent for a long time. "Your son is Àbíkú," he said finally. "He has been Àbíkú 4 times before. The others were also him." The words landed on Aduke like a hand on the chest. Not a surprise, exactly. She had known. Somewhere beneath the hoping and the counting of breaths and the careful learning to unclench, she had known. The way you know weather before it arrives, a pressure change, a quality of light, an ache in the joints of old knowledge. "He comes back to you because you call him," the Babalawo said. "Your grief pulls him back before he can find peace elsewhere. You must make a pact." The pact he described was practical and terrible in the way of real things. There were marks to be made, cuts in the skin, small ones, deliberate, placed on the ankle where they could be recognized. The marks told the spirit world, "This one is spoken for. This one has debts here. Let him stay a little longer." There were also words to be said. Not prayers exactly, more like negotiations, acknowledgements, the living acknowledging the dead, the living acknowledging the spirit world's claim, the living asking, not demanding, for more time. And there was a promise Aduke had to make, the hardest part, that she would not grieve too loudly for him, that if he died again, she would do the proper things and let him go, rather than pulling him back with her sorrow to repeat the cycle forever. The Àbíkú come back because they are loved too hard, the Babalawo said. The love becomes a chain. Aduke made the marks on her son's ankle. She said the words. She made the promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The boy grew. He grew to 7, 8, 9. Every birthday was a small victory that Aduke celebrated in private, with a particular kind of relief that other mothers might not recognize. The relief of a woman counting days she was never sure she'd get. He grew to 12 and lost his first tooth late, which made him furious and made Aduke laugh for the first time in years. A real laugh, one that came from below the careful place where she kept her feelings managed. He grew to 14 and had opinions about everything, about the food, about the work, about the particular unfairness of having to carry water when the other boys were playing. Aduke found even his complaints beautiful. Complaints meant investment in the world. Complaints meant he planned to stay. He grew to 17 and left home to apprentice with a tailor in the city. The morning he left, Aduke stood in the compound and watched him walk down the road until he was small, and then smaller, and then gone. And she let him go. That was the practice. She understood. Every day of his life had been practice for this particular kind of holding. To love without gripping. To watch him walk away and let the watching be enough. She stood there until the dust settled. Then she went back inside and ground the pepper and swept the yard and did the ordinary things that ordinary days are made of. He came back to visit at 22. He was a man by then, taller than his father had been, with his father's jaw and eyes that belonged to someone Aduke couldn't name. Someone from further back in the line. Someone who had made it through. He sat with her by the fire, and they talked until late. About the city, about the tailoring trade, about a woman he'd met, whose laugh he kept circling back to in conversation. The way people do, when they don't yet know that what they're describing is love. At some point, she looked down at his ankle. The marks were still there, faded but present. A record. A contract written in skin. "Do you remember?" she asked. "What you told me when you were 6? He thought about it. "Vaguely," he said. "Like a dream. You said you had to go back. He was quiet for a while. The fire moved. An ember fell and sent a brief constellation of sparks into the dark air above them. I'm still here, he said. I know, she said. She didn't tell him the rest, that she had kept the promise. Every day of his life, every day that she loved him, she also held the love carefully, kept it from becoming a grip, let it remain open-handed. Every day, she loved him in a way that, if the time came, he could walk through. She had been learning how to love without chaining for 22 years. Some days she got it right. The fire burned low between them. Somewhere outside, the insects were loud with nighttime business. Her son fell asleep in his chair, the way children do, suddenly, completely. And she watched him breathe and let herself feel everything she felt, right up to its edge. And then she set it down. He was here tonight. That was enough. That was the whole world. If you have children, if you have anyone you love that fiercely, you know the arithmetic of it. You know that holding too hard is a kind of harm. The Yoruba gave that knowledge a name and a story and marks on an ankle. They built a whole theology around the problem of love that won't let go. Your son is home tonight, or your daughter, or your mother, or your friend. They are breathing. They are here. Hold that lightly, the way you hold water in a cupped hand, and you'll hold it longer. Rest easy. We have more stories. There is a spirit who lives in rivers and oceans, across 1,000 miles of West and Central Africa. She has been known by different names, in different places, and different centuries. But the name that has spread farthest, that has crossed the Atlantic with the people who were taken across it, is Mami Wata, Mother Water, the water that mothered everything. She is beautiful. Descriptions vary. She is sometimes depicted as a woman from the waist up, and a fish or serpent below, sometimes as a full woman walking along the riverbank, sometimes as something the eye can't quite resolve into a shape it has words for. What doesn't vary? She is beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when beauty is not the point, when beauty is just the surface of something that doesn't care whether you survive it. She takes lovers. This is the part the stories agree on. She takes them to the deep, or to a palace somewhere beneath the surface that shouldn't exist but does, and she keeps them for a time. What happens there? The stories don't say, partly because the ones who come back can't explain it in words, and partly because the ones who come back are never quite the same person who left, and the new person isn't always sure what the old person experienced. Some come back, some don't. The ones who do return often have gifts, the ability to heal, an unusual prosperity, a kind of knowledge that sits strangely on them, like clothing that belongs to someone else. They also have an absence in them, a piece removed, something they left behind in the deep without quite meaning to. The man's name was Emeka, and he was a fisherman, and he was not stupid. He had grown up in a village on the river's edge, a village where the water was the first thing you saw in the morning and the last thing you heard at night. The soft slap of it against the canoes pulled up on the bank, the particular sound it made when the current shifted direction in the hours before dawn. He knew the river, the way you know a neighbour's face, every mood, every expression, the specific colour it turned before a storm, the way the surface dimpled when the catfish were running deep. He had grown up with the stories, and he understood, in the way you understand things before they happen to you, that Mami Wata was real, and that you did not seek her out. You went on the water, and you kept your eyes forward, and you did not stare at anything unusual in the water's surface, and you came home before dark. He had done this successfully for 33 years. The 34th year, his wife died. Fever. Over a week. No remedy working. And then she was gone. And he was alone in the house they had built together. And the river was still there outside, indifferent, doing what rivers do. He started staying out past dark, not looking for anything, just unable to make himself go back inside, to the absence she'd left there. The house was too full of her, and too empty of her at the same time. And the river at night was neither. It was simply itself, enormous, unconcerned. And there was comfort in that. He would sit in his canoe and let the current turn him slowly, and watch the stars reflected in the water, and not think about anything in particular. The grief moved through him, the way the current moved beneath him, present, continuous, not going anywhere. The first time he saw something in the water, he looked away. He knew the rule. The second time, he looked away, but more slowly. The third time, he didn't look away at all. What he saw, or what he allowed himself to see, was a disturbance in the water that was not the current, and was not a fish, and was not the reflection of anything above. It moved with a deliberateness that belonged to something alive, something that had noticed him the way he had noticed it, and was deciding. The water around his canoe warmed. This should not have happened. The river at night was cold, but the water went warm the way water warms when something large passes beneath you, something with a body temperature different from the river's. He should have paddled home. He should have broken the surface with his oar and made noise, and gone back to the absence in his house and endured it. He put his hand in the water instead. He came back 3 days later. He didn't remember the 3 days. What he did remember was the light, a quality of light under water that didn't belong to any light he'd experienced above the surface. Blue that was also green, that was also a colour he didn't have a name for, a colour that existed only in the deep, and that his eyes had somehow known how to see. And the sound, not silence, which is what he'd expected, but a kind of music that wasn't music, rhythms and harmonics that were almost a language, that he almost understood, that stopped making sense the moment he tried to listen deliberately. like a conversation in the next room, close enough to hear the shape of the words, too far to catch them. He remembered her voice. He didn't remember her face. He had looked directly at it, and it had done something to the part of his mind that normally recorded faces, and all that was left was an impression. Vast, calm, interested in him, the way the ocean is interested in a raft. She had asked him what he wanted. He thought he had answered her. He didn't remember what he said. He came back on a Thursday morning, standing waist-deep in the shallows, soaking wet. The 3 days completely absent from his memory. The village found him. He wasn't cold, which was the first unusual thing. He wasn't hungry, which was the second. The third unusual thing didn't show itself until later. He started knowing things. Not everything. Not in a way that announced itself dramatically. More like, a woman came to him with a sick child, and he found himself saying things about what to do. And the child got better. A man came to him with a legal dispute over land that had been snarling in courts for years. And Emeka looked at the documents, and something clicked into place. And he told the man exactly what argument to make. He didn't know how he knew. He just knew. He was prosperous, in ways that didn't quite add up to his fishing catch. He was healthy. He was calm. He was also, slowly, not quite himself. It happened the way a tide happens, so gradually that no single moment was the moment. And then one day you looked, and the shoreline had moved. His friends still loved him. His family still recognized him. But there was something in his eyes that had been there since the river. A quality of distance, like someone who knows an ending that hasn't arrived yet. He laughed less. Not because he was unhappy, he wasn't, but because the laughter that came from the deep place, where laughter lives, had to travel further to reach his face. It arrived delayed, diminished, like light reaching the surface from the bottom of a deep river. He never went back on the water after dark. He never spoke about the 3 days. When people asked, he smiled and said he had been unwell and lost track of time. The village accepted this. People get sick. People lose time. The explanation was thin, but it was the kind of thin that everyone agreed to accept, because the alternative, asking what really happened, hearing the answer, having to decide what to do with it, was worse. They noticed things, though. The way Emeka's hands moved differently now. Not clumsy, the opposite. Too precise. As if each gesture were being translated from a language that didn't use hands. The way he would stop mid-conversation and tilt his head, as if listening to something under the other person's words, something they hadn't said. His oldest friend, a man named Chukwu, who had fished alongside him since boyhood, said to his own wife one night, "He's the same man, but there's more of him now. Or less. I can't tell which." The women who came for healing kept coming. The knowledge kept working. Emeka never charged for it. He couldn't have explained where it came from, and charging for knowledge that wasn't yours felt like a debt that would come due eventually. So he gave it freely, and people brought him things: yams, palm oil, a length of cloth, not as payment, but as the kind of gratitude that needs a physical form to feel real. He was, by any measure, a man whose life had improved. The fishing was better. The house was full. People respected him. He was also hollowing out. Not visibly. Not in a way that a healer could find, or a friend could name. But there was a thinning at the centre of him. A place where something had been that was now occupied by the knowledge and the calm and the prosperity, gifts stacked in the shape of what they'd replaced. So the outline looked the same, but the weight was different. His daughter, who was 11 years old, and sharp-eyed, in the way that children are sharp-eyed when they've grown up watching a parent, for signs of something they can't name, asked him once, "Are you still you, Papa?" He thought about it for a long time. Long enough that she got nervous. Long enough that the question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a fire that neither of them had lit. "Mostly," he said. She didn't ask what the other part was. She was 11, but she was her father's daughter, and she understood that some questions are better left in the shape of a question. The people who have what Mami Wata gives, the knowledge, the prosperity, the healing, they pay for it in ways they don't fully account for beforehand. Something goes with her to the deep. Something that was specifically yours, particular to you, that she keeps. You come back with gifts, and without the peace that made you completely yourself. There are worse bargains. There are better ones. The river doesn't ask which you'd prefer. Rest easy. The hunters in the Akan forests of Ghana have a word for the moment when you've gone too far. You know the feeling. You've walked longer than you planned. The light has changed, not dimming exactly, but shifting. The quality of it getting strange. The shadows going the wrong direction for the time of day. The forest has stopped sounding like the forest you know, and started sounding like something else, wearing the forest's clothing. That's when you've gone too far. The experienced hunters turn back at that feeling. The inexperienced ones keep going. Sasabonsam waits in the odum trees. Abies the odum is an enormous hardwood. Ancient specimens can reach 40 meters high, and their canopies spread wide enough to swallow the light beneath them entirely. They live for centuries. They grow slowly, and they outlast everything around them. The smaller trees, the undergrowth, the human settlements that rise and fall at the forest's edge. The Akan have long known not to camp under odum trees, not to sleep near them, not to spend longer than necessary in their shadow. The trees belong, in a sense that is difficult to explain to someone who grew up thinking of trees as lumber or scenery, to a different category of things. Sasabonsam looks like a man, if you're not looking carefully. From above, from the canopy, it looks like a stillness that has taken a shape. Large, thin in the wrong places, red eyes that catch light in the way eyes aren't supposed to catch light, reflecting back something that isn't there to be reflected. Rattray, the British anthropologist who spent years among the Ashanti in the early 1900s, was told that Sasabonsam has bat-like wings and red skin and lives only in the densest parts of the forest, where no path runs and no human has reason to go. The people he spoke with were not uncertain about this. They described Sasabonsam the way you describe a leopard or a river, factually, without drama, as a feature of the landscape that you plan around. Its feet are hooks. This is the practical detail the stories keep returning to. The feet end in hooks, rather than anything human, and it hangs from branches with them, inverted, and waits. When something passes below, an animal, a person, a hunter who walked too far, the hooks release, and Sasabonsam falls with a terrible precision, and the iron teeth do what iron teeth do. Kofi was 17 years old, and he had been hunting with his uncle since he was 9. He was good at it. He was quiet in the forest, and he had good instincts, and he knew most of the rules. The rule about odum trees he had heard many times. He had heard the story of Sasabonsam many times. He was not a person who dismissed stories. His uncle had raised him better than that, had taught him that the stories were the same as the terrain maps and the weather signs and the animal tracks. Information, hard-won over generations, encoded in a form that was easy to carry and hard to forget. But it was a bad day. The animals were elsewhere. The uncle had sent him ahead to scout, and Kofi had followed a trail longer than he should have, through undergrowth that got thicker and light that got thinner, until he came to a clearing he didn't recognize. And in the middle of the clearing stood an odum tree, so large that its canopy turned the air beneath it into something like indoor air, dim and still, and separate from the sky. He stopped at the tree's shadow line. He stood there for a while, looking up. The canopy was thick, layer upon layer of leaves and branches, and the kind of darkness that isn't absence of light, but presence of something else. Whatever was up there was invisible. He heard nothing. No birds. The birds had stopped, and he hadn't noticed the moment they stopped. And now he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard one. That was the detail that his uncle had mentioned years ago. As if in passing, the birds go quiet first. Not quiet the way they go quiet for a hawk. That's a sharp silence. Sudden. Alarmed. A silence that says, something is happening. This was a different quiet. A quiet that had been going on for a while. A quiet that said, something has been here for a long time, and the birds have long since made other arrangements. Kofi backed up one step, then two. The shape in the canopy was perfectly still. He couldn't see it, But there was a stillness up there that wasn't the kind of stillness that comes from absence. It was the kind that comes from something that is very good at not moving, something that has had a very long time to practice. Kofi turned around and walked back the way he had come. He did not run. Running was not the correct choice. Some instinct told him. Running said, "I know what you are, and I am afraid." Walking said, "I was simply walking, and now I am walking in a different direction." He walked until the birds came back. Then he walked a little farther. Then he sat down against a tree that was not an odum tree and breathed for a while. His uncle found him there 20 minutes later. Kofi didn't explain. His uncle looked at him, at the pallor under his skin, at his hands, which were not shaking but were held with the particular care of someone who is preventing them from shaking, at his eyes, and said nothing. They walked home in silence. They never hunted in that part of the forest again. Kofi never told anyone the story. Exactly. He didn't know what story he'd have to tell. He hadn't seen anything. He had seen a tree. He had seen a stillness in a canopy. He had walked away. That was the whole story. It was also the right story to tell. If you know anything about how these things work, you see it coming. You leave. That's how you stay in the version of the story where you're the one telling it. The experienced ones turn back. Sleep well. The Obayifo is not a monster. This is what makes it difficult. It is a person. Specifically, it is a person who was born with a fire in their chest, or who acquired it in circumstances the stories disagree about. A fire that feeds on life rather than wood or oil. When the fire is hungry, the Obayifo leaves their body at night. Not literally. The body remains in bed, breathing, warm, looking for all purposes like a sleeping person. But something departs, a light, a spirit, a thing that is the Obayifo without the Obayifo's form, and moves through the village, seeking what it needs. The light has been described as phosphorescent, as bluish, as moving with a deliberateness that distinguishes it from fireflies or lanterns. It moves low, close to the ground, close to the houses, pausing at doorways, the way a person pauses before deciding whether to enter. If you see it, and recognize it for what it is, you should go inside. In daylight, the Obayifo is your neighbour, your cousin, the woman who grinds grain 2 houses over, the man who told you a good story last week at the palm wine seller's stall. They don't know, always, what they are. Some do. Some have chosen it, inherited the fire deliberately, made arrangements with certain forces that are better not named. But others carry it without fully understanding the bargain, waking in the morning with an emptiness that hunger doesn't account for, going about their day, sleeping well, leaving their body at night without remembering it when they rise. crops that fail inexplicably, the child who wakes pale and crying and can't say what frightened them, the young man who was healthy at harvest and sick by planting season, a slow drain that no healer can reverse because the cause is not a disease, but a hunger. The Obayifo is working, in the night, feeding the fire. In a village whose name doesn't matter, it could be any village, there was a woman named Abina who everyone liked. This is not unusual. The Obayifo is often well liked. They are often pleasant, generous, easy to be around. The theories vary. Some say the fire creates a warmth in its host that people are drawn to without knowing why. Some say the people who make the bargain consciously do so partly for the social ease it brings. Some say it's coincidence, and we notice it only because it fits the story we tell afterward. Abina brought food when people were sick. She remembered names and birth dates and the little details that make people feel seen. She was funny, in a dry way, the kind of humour that doesn't demand laughter, but earns it. She had been in the village for 11 years, since she came from her husband's village after the marriage, and in 11 years she had made herself belong there. The first sign was the yams. They failed. Not just her plot, which you could attribute to bad soil, or bad seed, or bad luck, but 3 plots in a row on one side of the village. The roots were shriveled, wrong, as if something had taken what was meant to be there before it could grow. The farmers were baffled. There had been good rain. The other crops were fine. The second sign was a child, the son of a woman named Efua, 4 years old, who had been healthy in June and was pale and listless by August, crying in his sleep, unable to say what frightened him, because there was nothing he could point to, no dream he could describe, just a feeling that something had been in the room. His mother, Efua, had done everything. The healers, the prayers, the remedies that work for ordinary illness. Nothing took hold. The boy wasn't getting worse quickly. He was getting worse slowly, which was harder to watch, because slow decline gives you time to hope between each step down. The third sign was the light. One of the old women of the village, Nana Amma, who had lived long enough to have seen things that most people only heard about, was awake one night with a bad knee, sitting near the window, when she saw something moving between the houses. A light, moving with deliberateness, pausing near Efua's house. She didn't tell anyone immediately. She was old enough to know that accusations once made couldn't be unmade, and she was not certain, and certainty mattered. The cost of calling someone an Obayifo was too high to carry on a guess. A wrong accusation was its own kind of violence. It destroyed a life, even if you apologized later, because the word, once spoken, leaves a shape in the air that an apology can't undo. She watched for 3 more nights. 3 nights of sitting at the window with her bad knee and a blanket, and the patience that comes from having lived long enough to know that the truth usually reveals itself to people who are willing to stay awake for it. On the 4th night, the light moved from Abina's house. It rose from the direction of her doorway, not through the door exactly, but from the area where the door was, as if the wall were not quite solid, to a thing like this. and it drifted low across the compound, and it paused at Afua's doorway, and then it went in. Nana Ama watched. She watched the way you watch when you already know what you're seeing and are gathering the last piece of evidence that you hoped you wouldn't find. What happened after is a story that the people who tell it tell differently. Some say the village confronted Abina and she confessed. Some say she didn't confess, but was made to leave. Not violently, but with the particular firmness of a community that has decided something and will not be moved from it. Some say she genuinely didn't know what she was. That when Nana Ama told her, Abina's face held something that looked like horror. The specific horror of a person who has learned something about themselves they would rather not know. The horror of looking back. At 11 years of kindness, and wondering whether the kindness was real, or whether it was what the fire put on the surface to keep the vessel undisturbed. The stories agree on the ending. She left. The yams recovered. The child got better. Nana Ama, who had spent 4 nights watching, who had been the one to speak the thing into words, who had the weight of it on her, in a way no one else quite shared. Nana Ama said afterward that she thought the worst part wasn't what Abina had done. It was what Abina had been. She was kind, Nana Ama said. She really was kind. The fire doesn't change that. The fire was in her, and she was also genuinely kind. And both things were true. And that's harder to hold than the simple story. The Obayifo is your neighbour. The fire feeds, regardless of intention. You know people you can't fully account for. People who are kind and also take something from you that you can't name. The world is full of Obayifo who don't know they are. It doesn't excuse it. It explains it. Rest now. The night is well along. Among the Yoruba, the ancestors return. Not as memory, not as influence, not as the kind of ghost that is really just grief with a face on it. The ancestors return in festival, wearing cloth. The Egungun masquerade is one of the oldest continuous ritual practices in West Africa. Performers dressed in elaborate layered costumes, cloth upon cloth upon cloth, the face entirely covered, the human form hidden inside something that is no longer a person, but has become a vessel for the dead. The Egungun walks through the village, and the village recognizes it as the dead. Not the person inside the cloth, the dead. You don't address the person inside. You address who they're carrying. You step aside. You bow. You receive the blessing or the rebuke, because both can come from the dead, and both are what you deserve and what you need. There are rules. There are always rules when the dead are involved. The Egungun does not remove the costume in public, ever. To see the human face inside the costume, to see that the vessel is a person, is considered a desecration, and the consequences are the kind of consequences that get called taboo, because catastrophe is too small a word, and punishment implies something deliberate. And what happens when the rules break is less deliberate than that. More like structural failure, like removing a keystone. The mask stays on. The dead can walk among the living only because both sides agree to the boundary that the cloth creates. This is the story of a man who couldn't take the costume off. His name was Taiwo. He was a second-generation Egungun performer, trained by his father, who had been trained by his father's father. He knew the traditions from the inside, the protocols, the particular ways certain ancestors spoke, the specific movements that meant welcome, and the movements that meant warning. He was good at it. He had the kind of stillness in the body that the role requires, a way of moving that became genuinely ambiguous, neither quite human nor quite not. When he put on the costume and walked into the street, people who knew him well, his wife, his closest friends, could not always tell that it was him inside. That was the point. It was supposed to stop being him. The festival came. He put on the costume. What happened inside the costume during festivals was difficult to describe, even to those who experienced it regularly. There was a loss of self. Not a frightening loss, usually. More like the particular amnesia of deep concentration, where afterward you couldn't fully reconstruct what you'd been doing, but the doing itself had been clear. You became something larger than yourself. You carried the dead, the way a river carries silt, not carrying them as a separate thing, but so thoroughly mixed that you were both at once. Taiwo had experienced this many times. He was not frightened by it. The boundary between himself and the thing he became inside the cloth was a boundary he could cross and come back from. The way you cross a river and step out dry on the other side. But this festival, the loss went further. He walked the village. He received the prayers. He spoke the words. The dead needed said. Words that came from somewhere he couldn't locate in himself, that arrived in his mouth, fully formed, in a cadence that wasn't his. He did all of this correctly. From somewhere inside the costume that he could still reach. But when the time came to end, when the festival concluded, when the performers withdrew, when it was time for the cloth to be removed, and the men inside to emerge back into themselves, Taiwo found something he had not expected. He could not find the way out. Not physically. Physically, he knew how to remove the costume. His hands knew the fastenings, the layers, the order of removal. But the thing that had come to fill the costume during the festival had not fully departed. The self that was Taiwo, the self that had a wife, a particular memory of his father's face, preferences about food, a bad ankle from an old injury, the specific weight and texture of his own ordinary life. That self was there, but it was far away, and getting farther, like trying to hear someone speaking through layers of cloth. The other performers helped him remove the costume. The cloth came off. His face was visible. He was standing in the ordinary air of the ordinary world. He was not entirely back. It took 3 days. 3 days during which Taiwo answered when spoken to, but answered from a distance, as if he were translating from another language inside his head. 3 days during which he would stop mid-sentence and turn towards something no one else could see, and his face would hold an expression of recognition, not fear, recognition, as if someone he knew had just walked into the room. His wife sat with him. She talked to him about small, specific, ordinary things. The crack in the courtyard wall, the particular stubbornness of their youngest child, the price of tomatoes at the market, tethering him to the inventory of an ordinary life. She was mapping the route home. Every small detail was a landmark. This is your wall. This is your child. These are your tomatoes. She was saying, without saying it, this is the life you come back to. Follow the details. On the third day, in the middle of the afternoon, he blinked and was present. He told his wife, "I stayed too long." She said, "I know." He never performed as Egungun again. Not because the tradition had failed, or because something had gone wrong. Because some instruments are not meant to be played the same way twice, by the same pair of hands. And he had learned this about himself the hard way. What he told his wife later, when the 3 days had settled into something he could speak about. The experience inside the costume had always been like standing in a current. The dead moved through him, and he moved with them, and the movement had a direction, and the direction was always back toward the living. This time, the current had reversed. The direction was away. Not maliciously. The dead were not pulling him. They were simply going home, the way water goes downhill. And he was in the water. His wife had been the shore, the crack in the wall, the tomatoes, their youngest child's stubbornness. Each detail a handhold she'd placed in the current for him, and he had reached for them, one by one, until his hands remembered what they were for. He told her, "If you hadn't talked, I would have gone with them. Not because I wanted to, because the current was stronger than anything I had on this side, except your voice." She didn't cry. She had done her crying during the 3 days, quietly, in the hours between talking to him, when she went outside to breathe and came back in with her voice steady and another small detail ready. "I know," she said. "That's why I kept talking." His father's costume remained in the house. He could have given it away. Another performer, someone younger, someone who hadn't gone as far. He didn't. The costume was his father's before it was his, and his grandfather's before that. And what lived in it was not something you handed to a stranger without understanding what you were handing over. Sometimes, late at night, Taiwo could feel the weight of what had lived in it. Not haunting exactly, something more like the impression a heavy thing leaves in cloth when you remove it. The shape of an absence. A door, closed but not locked, that he walked past every day, knowing what was on the other side. He lived a long and ordinary life. He was good to his children. He was good to his wife. He fixed the things that broke, and sat in the compound in the evenings, and watched the light change, and felt, most days, like the correct size. He never quite forgot the feeling of being larger than himself, and he never went looking for it again. And he was not sure which of those things was the right choice. The dead come back because we invite them. We make doors for them, and they walk through. And the protocol for closing the doors matters. Tonight, the doors are closed. The ancestors are where they belong. Sleep carries you somewhere, but it brings you back. That's the agreement. Rest easy. The Asanbosam is a fact of the forest. We met its cousin earlier tonight, the Sasabonsam, deep in the odum trees, in the part of the forest where no path runs. The Asanbosam is closer to home. It lives in the canopy of the trees that line the roads, the trees you walk under every day, the trees you stop thinking about because they're always there. It sits in the high branches, the places where the branches interlock so thickly that light doesn't reach the ground beneath. It waits with the patience of something that has been waiting since before patience was a concept that humans named. Its feet are hooks, iron, or something that functions as iron. They curl over branches the way a bird's talons curl, and it hangs there, and it waits. Its teeth are also iron. This is the detail the stories keep. When something passes below, when you walk under the wrong tree, at the wrong time, in the wrong part of the forest, the hooks release, and the Asanbosam descends with a velocity that has nothing graceful about it, and the iron teeth do their work. That's the whole story. There is no lesson in it. There is no moral. There is no protagonist who makes a choice that leads to this outcome. You simply went under the tree, and the Asanbosam was there, and that was the end of your particular story. The Akan communities of Ghana built roads through the forest with this knowledge as infrastructure. Not metaphorical infrastructure, literal. The roads went where they went, partly because of where the Asanbosam trees were known to be. The forest was mapped, culturally, with certain areas simply marked as places you did not go. Not for reasons that required detailed explanation, just not there. Not at dusk. Not alone. Not without announcing yourself first. Announcing yourself in the forest meant making noise. Noise meant you weren't trying to sneak through. It meant you were travelling openly, as a living person with a destination, not creeping in the ambiguous way of things that had other kinds of business. This is practical knowledge. The people who compiled it over generations weren't superstitious, or rather, their superstition was indistinguishable from applied ecology, from the knowledge that certain areas of old-growth forest contained dangers that were real, even if the name you put on them was Asanbosam. The name helped. The name gave the danger a form, and a form that could be thought about, anticipated, worked around. The story they tell about the Asanbosam is usually second-hand. You hear about someone else, someone's uncle, a stranger from the next village. The details get sparse. They went into the forest. They didn't come back. A body was found, or wasn't found. The person who had a direct encounter and survived. This is rare, because the encounter is not typically survivable. Except for one case, often told. A hunter who heard the hook release above him and fell sideways. More reflex than thought. And the Asanbosam came down, not quite where it had aimed. He ran. He reached the road. He didn't stop until he was well out of the forest and among other people. What he said afterward: "It looked at me when I ran." From the ground. It was already looking at the next tree. Not angry. Not thwarted, just calculating, adjusting, like he was a problem that hadn't been solved yet, and the Asanbosam was deciding whether the investment of the next tree was worth it. He reached the road. The Asanbosam stayed in the forest. Roads, in this story, are not metaphors. They are why he lived. Walk the roads. Make noise. Don't go into old-growth forest alone at dusk. These are not superstitions. They are instructions. Sleep now. On the slopes of Mount Cameroon, which is a volcano, and active, and has been erupting intermittently for centuries, the Bakweri people have long understood that certain spirits live in the mountain's rivers. The spirits are called Jengu, singular Liengu. They look, in the accounts, somewhat like humans, and somewhat not. Beautiful, in the way the river is beautiful, with the river's quality of being entirely itself and entirely indifferent to you at the same time. They can heal. They can bring good fishing. They can be petitioned, carefully, with the right offerings in the right form, said in the right way. The relationship between the Bakweri and the Jengu is not a simple supplication, human begging, spirit granting. It's more like a negotiation between two parties who have been doing business for a very long time, who have established protocols, who know the difference between a reasonable ask and overreach. The Jengu are not hostile. They are also not charitable. They give what they give because the giving is part of a reciprocal arrangement, and the arrangement has limits. The limits are the point of this story. A man named Mbella had been coming to the river at the same place for 40 years. His grandfather had taught him the form of the petition, and his grandfather's grandfather had taught his grandfather. It was not written down anywhere. It lived in the body, in how you stood, in what you said, in how you moved your hands when you made the offering, in the angle of your head, in the particular quiet you held in your chest during the pause after speaking. For 40 years, the relationship had worked. His fishing was good when it needed to be good. His children were healthy. When his wife fell ill with something the healers couldn't reach, he came to the river with the petition, and she recovered. He was not extravagant in his asks. He understood the difference between a reasonable ask and overreach. He had watched his grandfather navigate that line, and he had tried to hold the same line. The 41st year, his grandson was ill, badly ill. The kind of illness where healers are working, but their faces say, "We are working. We don't know." Mbella went to the river. He made the petition. He made it in the right form, in the right place, standing the right way, with the right offering. He made the ask, and then he made it again, more urgently, and then more urgently than that. His grandfather had told him, "You ask once, in the proper form, and then you wait. You do not repeat the petition. Repeating it changes the nature of the ask from request to demand, and the Jengu respond differently to demands." Mbella knew this. He had been taught this alongside the words themselves, as inseparable from them as rhythm is from song, but his grandson was very sick, and the healers' faces were doing the thing he didn't want to read, and the knowledge that had held firm for 40 years broke under the weight of one child's breathing. He could not stop himself. The river did not respond. The water moved the way water moves. The offering he'd brought did not appear to have been received. He went home. His grandson recovered. Not from the river, or not obviously from the river, but from the healer's work, and time, and whatever it is that makes some sick people recover, and not others. The boy was fine. Mbella went back to the river to say thank you, which was also part of the protocol. The river was different. Not different in a way he could point to. The water was water. The bank was the bank. The rocks were where they'd been for 40 years of his coming here. But the quality of the place had changed. The same way a house changes after a relationship ends. Everything is where it was. Nothing is where it was. He made the thanks offering. He spoke the words. Nothing received them. He came back the next season with a petition. A small one. A reasonable one. Exactly the kind he would have made 10 years ago, without a second thought. The river did not receive that either. He had broken the protocol. Not by asking for too much. The ask itself was within range. He had broken it by asking in the wrong way. Repeating. Insisting. Treating a negotiation like a demand. The Jengu don't punish. They simply stop engaging. There is no anger in it. There is no grudge. There is just, the arrangement is over. You breached the terms. Find another arrangement. Mbella fished without the river's help for the rest of his life. The fishing was fine. Not extraordinary, but fine. He caught what the river offered to anyone who put a line in the water, which was enough to live on, but not enough to forget what he'd had before. The hardest part was not the loss of prosperity. It was walking to the river every morning and standing at the same place where 40 years of relationship had lived, and feeling nothing come back. Like speaking into a room where someone used to answer, and hearing only your own voice return off the walls. He still stood correctly. He still held his body in the posture his grandfather had taught him. Not because it would change anything. The arrangement was over. But because the form was the last thing he had from the relationship. And letting it go would have meant letting go of the memory of it working. His grandson watched him do this for years. The boy understood, before Mbella ever explained it, that his grandfather was performing a petition that would never be received. That the form had become a kind of mourning. He taught his grandson the protocol, including the story of his own breach, specifically the part where he couldn't stop himself, where the fear for the boy had overridden everything he knew. "That's the hardest thing to teach," he said. "Not what to say, not how to stand, how to ask once, properly, and then let it go. How to trust that you did the thing right and the outcome is not yours to control. Most people fail there," he said. "I failed there. The river still runs, the Jengu are still there. Someone else who held the line is still in good standing. Some things can't be taken back. The relationship changes. You live in the changed one. Rest now. The water is still." In the villages of the Yewe people, in Togo, and the southeastern corner of Ghana, the fireflies come out at dusk. They move through the warm air the way fireflies move everywhere, blinking, drifting, tracing slow arcs between the houses and the palm trees and the low cooking fires. They are small and ordinary, and no one watches them closely because there is nothing to watch, except that sometimes one of them is not a firefly. The Adze looks like a firefly, in the same way a trap looks like the ground around it, close enough to pass, wrong in ways you'd have to be looking for to catch. Its light is slightly steadier than a real firefly's blink. It moves with slightly more purpose. It drifts toward houses rather than away from them. But these are differences you notice afterward, if you notice them at all. In the moment, in the warm dark, with a dozen real fireflies blinking around it, the Adze is invisible. It enters through gaps, under the door, through the space between thatch bundles, through the window opening that you left uncovered because the night was hot and the breeze was the only relief. It finds sleeping people. It prefers children. What it does to them is not dramatic. That's the design of it. No wound, no mark, no sound that would wake anyone. The child sleeps through it. Everyone sleeps through it. But in the morning, or the morning after that, the child is a little less, a little paler, a little less interested in running, or laughing, or doing the things that children do when they are full of life. The appetite fades. The energy drops. It looks like a mild illness. It looks like nothing. The Adze drinks blood, not in the visible way, not through the skin, but through proximity, through the kind of feeding that doesn't leave evidence. It also takes coconut water and palm oil from the stores, which is how the Yewe sometimes confirm that an Adze has been visiting. The levels in the jars drop faster than they should, and no one in the household is responsible. There was a woman named Afi, whose son, Koku, was 7 years old and had been slowing down. Not suddenly, gradually, the way a lamp dims when the oil runs low. Not a snap into darkness, but a long, quiet, decline. He had been the loudest child in the compound. He had been the one who climbed the palm trees when the adults said not to, who chased the chickens until they no longer ran from anyone else, because they'd spent all their running on him, who stayed awake past dark, asking questions about everything in the relentless way of a child who is learning the world by wearing out everyone in it. Then, over the course of 3 weeks, he quietened. Not the way children quieten when they're growing up. That's a natural slowing, a settling. This was different. The energy wasn't maturing. It was draining. Afi took him to the healer. The healer checked the usual things. No fever. No sores. No sign of anything that had a name, and therefore had a treatment. She brought him home. She fed him well. She watched him sleep. Watching him sleep is how she saw it. A light. Small. Steady. Moving across the ceiling of the room where Koku slept. Not a firefly exactly. A firefly would have blinked. This light held. It moved with a path that wasn't random, that had the quality of searching, of knowing what it was looking for. It settled near her son. Not on him. Near him. Close enough that Afi could feel the wrongness of it from across the room. The way you feel when someone is standing too close to you, with bad intent, even before they've done anything. She moved. She reached for a cloth, because the Ewe know that an Adze in firefly form can be caught. If you catch it, it reverts to its human shape, and then you know who it is, and then you know what to do next. But catching an Adze is like catching a specific firefly in a field of fireflies. You have to be faster than light, and you have to be certain which light is the wrong one. She missed. The light went out. Not gradually. Instantly. The way a firefly's light goes out. Between one blink and the next. Except this one hadn't been blinking. In the morning, she went to the elders. She described what she'd seen. They listened without interrupting, which is how you know that what you're saying is something they've heard before and take seriously. There are protections. Certain herbs burned in the room. Certain words spoken at the threshold. The door gap sealed with a specific kind of paste. The window covered, not with cloth, which an Adze can pass through, but with a woven mat, treated with specific preparations. These are not superstitions. They are architecture. the same way the Akan built roads around the Asanbosam trees. The Ewe built their nights around the Adze, sealing the gaps, treating the openings, making the house a closed system that the wrong kind of light could not enter. Afi sealed the room. She burned the herbs. She sat awake for 3 more nights. The light did not return. Koku's colour came back over the following week. His appetite returned. By the 2nd week, he was chasing the chickens again, and the chickens were once more exhausted. Afi never found out who the Adze was in human form. This is the part the story doesn't resolve, and the Ewe tradition is honest about that. Sometimes you don't catch it. Sometimes the protection works, and the Adze moves on to another house, another child, another open window. The knowledge that you saved your own sits alongside the knowledge that the thing is still out there. Those two things coexist, the way all true things coexist, uncomfortably, without resolution. The Adze is the smallest thing we've met tonight. Not a forest demon with hook feet, not a water spirit who pulls you to a palace in the deep. Just a light, a small, wrong, steady light in a room where a child sleeps. The gap under the door, the space in the window, the opening you forgot to close because the night was warm and you wanted the breeze. Close the gaps. Seal the room. Some things are small enough to get in through the places you didn't think about. Rest now. One more story. The last one. The gentlest one. In the Congo cosmology, the one that came from the Congo Basin and crossed the Atlantic in the bodies of enslaved people and became, in new soil, something that kept its roots, even as it grew new branches. There is a word. Nzambi. The word holds two things at once, which is the kind of word that tells you something about how its speakers understand the world. Nzambi is the supreme spirit, the force behind everything, the one that was there before the story started. But Nzambi is also what you call the dead, who have not fully departed, the ones who still walk, the ones whose souls have not yet completed the crossing from the world of the living to the world of the ancestors. Same word. Both things. The force that animates the living and the force that will not quite leave the dead. This is not, in the Congo tradition, a contradiction. It is an observation about continuity. Her name was Zola. She had been married for 31 years when she died. The illness was fast. A few weeks. The kind of thing that gives you enough time to say the things you meant to say, and not enough time to believe you're really saying them. Her husband's name was Kimber. He had never lived in a house without her. From the day of the marriage to the day she closed her eyes, she had been the first sound in the morning and the last movement at night. And the house without those things was a house he didn't know how to live in. She died on a Tuesday. She was buried properly, with the proper ceremony, with the proper words said, with the proper time observed. Everything was done correctly. Kimber did everything correctly, because doing it correctly was the only thing left he could do. 3 weeks after the burial, he woke at 2 a.m, and she was sitting in the chair by the window. Not a dream. He knew the difference. The chair creaked slightly when she shifted her weight. There was a smell that was her smell. Not perfume, just her. The smell of her skin, which he had been near for 31 years, and which was not something that should have been in the room. She looked like herself, except that she looked the way people look when they're tired, in a way that sleep doesn't fix. She wasn't frightening. She was his wife. He said, "What are you doing here?" She said, "I don't know. I think I'm not finished." He said, "Finished with what?" She looked around the room. She looked at him. She said, "I'm not sure, but there's something." They talked until just before dawn, when she left, in the way things leave in the night. Not dramatically, just, and then she wasn't there. This happened 3 more times over the following weeks, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always the same chair. The conversations were not significant. They talked about small things, the things you talk about when you've lived with someone for 31 years and run out of large things, and discovered that the small things were always what mattered anyway. The crack in the courtyard wall that he kept meaning to fix, the particular stubbornness of their youngest grandchild, the price of tomatoes, the conversations a life is actually made of when you strip away the ones you think are important. On the 5th night, she looked more tired than before. "You need to let me go," she said. "I haven't been holding you," he said. She looked at him with the particular look of someone who has loved you for a long time and knows things about you that you don't know about yourself. "Kimber," she said. He thought about the crack in the wall that he hadn't fixed, because fixing it would require him to be in the courtyard, which was where she had sat in the evenings, and he couldn't be there yet. He thought about her bowl that he had washed and put back exactly where she always put it, not in the stack with the other bowls, but in her place, as if she were coming back to eat from it. He thought about the way he woke up every morning, still expecting her weight on the other side of the bed, and the small daily collapse when the weight wasn't there. "Tell me what I have to do," he said. "Fix the wall," she said. "Use her bowl for your food. Sleep in the middle." None of these things were the large gestures of grief, the dramatic acts of letting go. They were just the ordinary negotiations of a life that had been made for 2, and now needed to be made for one. He said, "And then you'll go?" She said, "And then I'll go. Not because you're sending me, because I'll be finished." He fixed the wall that weekend. He used her bowl. He learned to sleep in the middle. None of it was easy. The wall was the simplest part. Just plaster, just a trowel, just the work of a morning. The bowl was harder. Eating from it meant accepting it as his, which meant accepting that it was no longer hers, which meant accepting something he wasn't ready to accept. Sleeping in the middle was the worst. He had slept on his side of the bed for 31 years. Moving to the centre meant filling the space she'd left, and filling it meant it was no longer empty. And if it was no longer empty, then she was no longer missing from it. And he wasn't ready for the missing to end, because the missing was the last place he still had her. He did it anyway. She came one more time, 2 weeks later. She was not in the chair. She was standing near the door. She looked like herself. She didn't look tired. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. He didn't know if he could have done the wall and the bowl and the middle of the bed without seeing her first. He didn't know if she was real, or if she was what grief does to a mind that loved someone for 31 years and couldn't process the absence all at once. He didn't think that question had a clean answer, and he decided it wasn't the right question. The right question was, did she love him that long? And did he love her? And did he do the things she asked? All three. Yes. The fire is ash now. The stories are done. The dead watch over the living. The living carry the dead. That's not horror. That's the whole arrangement. Tonight, someone you love is somewhere, near or far, living or not. They carry you too, in the way things carry what they've held. Sleep. The night is nearly done. You'll see the morning. The fire is out. The stories are done. If you're still awake, I'm impressed. If you drifted somewhere in the middle, somewhere in the river, or the forest, or the chair by the window, that's exactly right. That's what the fire was for. These stories have been kept for a very long time by people who understood something that's easy to forget. The dark isn't empty. It's full of everything that was here before us, and everything that will be hereafter. And most of it is not hostile. And some of it loves us. And all of it is patient. You don't have to believe any of that to sleep well tonight. But it doesn't hurt. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. If these stories are new to you, I'd encourage you to find more. There are entire traditions I didn't touch, entire peoples whose stories deserve their own long nights around a fire. We'll be back. Sleep well.